As we explore some of the largest and most interesting trees on our woodlot, I'd like to introduce you to Big Red. He's a red spruce, and he is a very fine example of a wolf tree. Now, wolf trees are created by virtue of growing in an area where they have virtually no competition. That tree is at an intersection of two logging trails, and you can see the very large limbs that are coming out of them. When trees are growing without competition, they tend to grow out sideways rather than grow tall. Although he's probably a 60-footer, I'm guessing 20 inches, maybe a tad more down at the butt. But they grow these big heavy limbs because it apparently is the most efficient way for them to get sunlight and produce food and growth for themselves. They, of course, in this condition, make themselves virtually unusable for good quality lumber or virtually anything else. He also has right in, where's my finger? Oh, right there, a fork. So again, makes them far less valuable for any potential timber. Contrast, this guy is a large white pine, and you can see he's grown probably close to 40 foot with absolutely no branches on him, and he's probably somewhere possibly 70 foot, which of course is only about half as tall as he can potentially grow. But he's probably the nicest formed. If you're going to put him on a sawmill, he would be the one. But of course here, he's just a seed source for the future. Another really interesting tree is this large white pine. He is probably the largest diameter tree that we have on the property, but right about or just over the 4-foot mark, he comes out into a total of, I think, 4 for sure, but I think there's 5 different heavy limbs, one of which currently makes the leader. Only 2 of them are still alive, and no, I guess there's 3. And he's had a couple of a dead one right up in, oops, yeah, right there. But he is possibly close to 3 foot, right down, at what we call diameter breast height, which is about 4.5 feet off the ground. This is simply a small seedling that will hopefully become one of our great trees in another 100 years or so. This area was cut quite hard in a commercial thinning, and of course, because of the presence of the large white pine, we are now getting quite a few, perhaps even several hundred seedlings that are now coming up, where before we couldn't get any of the white pine regeneration. It just wasn't, it was too thick. So that's one way that we'll gradually transition this from virtually a total fir white birch area to have at least a much better component of white pine, which is very desirable for the climate change.
This is a red oak on the property. They are relatively scarce, so they are greatly valued. Unfortunately for this guy, he's probably not going to live a long and healthy life. Just a sec.
This is one of 3 mature oak we have on the property, and unfortunately this seam is a fatal flaw, and it actually, if you can follow it down, goes right to about here. So it's very, very likely that at some point one of these limbs is going to break off and go down. The remaining one may hang on and survive for a fair number of years, but with that kind of wound, he's certainly compromised. One of my favorite trees of the woodlot, right in the center, is this big yellow birch. And quite old, you can tell by the bark, which doesn't have that young golden kind of yellow appearance. He looks significantly darker. Let's take a closer look. Okay, let's look close. You can see kind of in the fork right here, I would say there's some significant deterioration going on in there. And as we go up, right up in here, at the projection out on the right side of the left-hand stem, I believe is the chaga. I don't know if we can get in a little closer. Closer. That's close as we can get. And he's got a few, you know, broken limbs and so on. But he's a keeper. He's a keeper for the woodlot. We're going to just let him gradually pass away, but keep on seeding until that happens, and he'll make a pretty darn good cavity tree. Well, this is another learn from our mistakes video. This here is a white pine, and a very desirable tree for many reasons. It's a good climate change tree. So in our early days of this endeavor, working and trying to change the dynamics of our property, I came by here with a chainsaw and cleared out what I thought were all fir, so this young feller would have a chance to grow better. And one of the trees that I cut got hung up in the fork of this white birch right here, and he couldn't be moved. He was just jammed right in there. Anyhow, at some time later, realized that the tree that was hung up here in the birch was certainly the tallest, and at that time perhaps the only hemlock native to the whole property.
Oops.
Oops.
So why would that be a problem, that you cut down the hemlock?
Well, it's like everything. What we're trying to do here is get the appropriate tree species, and for this property, hemlock, white pine are very good choices. But we have probably a dozen and more large, mature white pine,
Right.
and any number of, you know, younger seedlings, more immature. So we have probably a total of 30, 40, 50 white pine on the property.
And
when you only have one hemlock, right, and you're seeking diversity, what you don't want to do is cut the only tree you have.
so this little guy is a little hemlock that is maybe 20 feet from the one that Michael cut down a few years ago. So it does seem strange that there would be two grow in that close a proximity, and we haven't been able to find the seed tree. So whether the seeds had been there for quite some time and this little guy just suddenly decided to grow, I don't know. But we haven't found a mature hemlock tree that this would have come from. So to our knowledge, this is the only remaining, what I would refer to as indigenous hemlock tree on the property. Now we will show you, we have planted a few, not great numbers, but we're hoping to gradually increase the number of hemlock that we have. So this is our largest hemlock on the property, and he is one that we planted. He didn't grow here naturally. We were looking for hemlock so we could increase the amount of hemlock on the property, and a neighbor offered us a few that he had growing along a brook beside the road. So we planted several. They didn't all survive, but this guy actually has been hanging in, must be what, 4 or 5 years ago anyway that we planted him, and so far he's doing pretty good. Now he has a bit of dieback, and he has had his tips nibbled by the white-tailed deer that are all through here, but I think he's going to be okay. Now, what I thought I'd show you is this is a balsam fir, and this is a hemlock, because we had never really seen hemlock and weren't sure what we were looking for when we were trying to find hemlock on the property, which was part of the problem with having that other one end up getting cut down. So you'll see a big difference in the size. The hemlock are very, very fine needles compared to the fir, and they do have a very obvious white stripe on the bottom. The fir has some, but it's certainly not as clear cut. And generally I find the hemlock are a little darker green than what the fir are. So don't make the same mistakes we do. Don't cut down your hemlock, because they're a far more valuable tree than your fir.
Amen.
This is a big old white pine out along our eastern side. Western. Why do I always get those backwards?
I don't know.
Any idea how old he might be, Mr. Hickey?
Oh, very difficult to tell how many years of suppression there may have been. I don't think, frankly, there's a tree on the property that would be more than 80 years old, but that's a semi-educated guess. And he's probably, I don't think he's quite 60 foot tall. So I always think of a tree growing roughly a foot a year, but again, that doesn't account for,
yeah, I think he's older than that,
suppression and so on. Yeah, he's certainly, well, he's a very good 20-inch diameter at what we call DBH.
which would be...
Well, why don't I step right over there and I'll show you.
Alrighty. Okay, Mr. Hickey, what's DBH?
Okay, it's a forestry term, diameter breast height. For me, that's here. Basically, they do not want you to measure the diameter of a tree down in the butt area where you often get a large flare.
Big flare out?
So when they talk about a 20-inch tree or whatever, they're always referring to approximately. It's roughly 4.5 feet tall.
Gee, that's almost as tall as me.
I was going to say, for you it's not breast height, it's more like nose height.
Yeah, just about. It's not an exact science, right?
Well, it is defined as 4.5 feet or 1.5 meters.
And that's the rule of thumb.
From the ground.
Yeah.
So, but again, if you're within a couple inches, you're not going to go far off in terms of...
I think for me it would be more than a couple inches, but okay.
Right.
This is a little further than what, DBH. But he does have some cool, interesting kind of twists in him.
Yep.
I'm not sure what that would have been from, but it does make him a more interesting tree on the property. We do have several large white pine that, for various reasons, obviously survived any earlier forestry work, and this one's just an interesting one because of all those strange twists going up its trunk. This great big old yellow birch is one of my favorites. It's just off to the side of the property line, so unfortunately it's not on our property, but I just think he's cool. He makes a great seat with this moss, and I see now he's got a little tree growing out of him. I don't know if he's birch or not.